Okay, cool. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for taking the time to come attend. Hopefully you'll take something out from today's session. Today's session is going to be on AI and ML from idea to FDA submission. Um, so first of all, why should you listen to me? I'm just some guy on the internet that you probably haven't met. Well, yeah, I've been co I've, so I've been programming computers ever since I was 8 years old. I've been doing it professionally for the last 10 years in the med device industry. And I've worked on 30 plus FDA cleared medical devices, software components, and lots of those do have a machine learning component as well in them. Um, I'm no expert by any means, but I mean, hopefully that this presentation you can learn things that I've learned from my experience and our experience, and you can learn from our past mistakes and probably apply it to your current product. Is my hope. So my company Analytics, we specialize in med device software engineering and regulatory consulting services. Here's some of our happy customers. Um, here's our leadership team between the three of us, and we have 18 other software engineers as well. We've got lots of experience that we can potentially help you with on your project. So, first of all, is this presentation for you? If you're currently planning on developing a med device with an AI component in the near future, and also keep in mind that the term med device can be kind of confusing because it implies it needs to have hardware, but software itself can be a med device. So even if your product has software only as an AI component, it could be considered a med device and therefore subject to all the rules and all the rules that we're going to be going over. Perhaps you've already developed an AI algorithm that that you want to get FDA cleared, or maybe you've recently gotten funded or acquired, or you've had some other event that requires you to tie up your machine learning processes, perhaps. Or maybe you're currently an investor, or you're trying to invest into a company and you want to secure FDA clearance for those companies in order to boost your portfolio value. Um, this is not for you if you're not interested in the US FDA. So if you're only interested in the EU, for example, or if your product does not have a machine learning or AI component. Now, most of the concepts and principles that I'll be talking about do apply in these cases, but they're very tightly coupled. Like the processes I'll be talking about are rather tightly coupled to US FDA and AI and ML. So you'll have to kind of apply that to your particular situation. Um, so here's a oversimplification of the pathway from going from just an idea all the way to all the way to FDA clearance. And just to clarify, these blocks don't necessarily happen in series. Like some of them will overlap a little bit, and also they're not drawn to scale. So like some of these blocks may take you 5 days, whereas other ones might take you 5 weeks. Um, and also, just to give you an idea about overall timeline and processing, you should expect the whole process to take about 18 months. And if you're going to raise capital, I would recommend raising at least $500,000. The costs will go up from there depending on your algorithm's complexity, what kind of performance targets that you're trying to meet, also risk, and if there's any changes to the technical or regulatory landscape that could happen during this time. Um, and that landscape is quickly shifting, and it's unfortunately shifting more toward more documentation and more burden, therefore longer timelines. So, like, I think if you're trying to do this process, I think sooner than later would be what I would do. We have several clients that have gone through this process and they're on the market, and we've got also some clients that are going through this process right now. We've talked to the FDA at several points here, and it's been a positive feedback from them. So before I get into the details of each of the four phases, I just want to go over some cognitive framework that I think would really help you guys learn this material. And it's definitely something that I wish I had when I first started learning as well. Um, the first one I think is really important is to just try to put yourself in the shoes of the FDA. Trying to understand, like, take a step back and start to understand where did the FDA come from. They came from a time when you had dangerous products on the market that made crazy marketing claims on their product packaging. Like you have a stick of this chewing gum that has like radium in it, and it's supposed to make you Superman or cure cancer or whatever, right? And so that was clearly a danger to the public, not just intrinsically that it's dangerous, but also because the labeling and what the manufacturing claimed that this thing does was not substantiated by science. And the layperson doesn't have the tools all the time to make that determination on their own. So the FDA really cares about what your product labeling, what you say your product does, and to prove that that is indeed true. Now, these days, especially with software, you don't really label them anymore, like in a printed box, at least not anymore. But the same principles apply to like like you probably have some sort of probably have like website online where you talk about where you advertise what your product does. That would be considered product. That would be an analog in today's digital world of product labeling. Um, and that's also another important concept I think to think about is to try to understand the spirit of the law, not necessarily the letter of the law. And really, what that's saying is try to understand why. And if you understand why, then you can apply what the FDA's reasoning is to your own particular situation and also any future products that come, any future developments that happen that the FDA may have not gotten around to having a guidance document yet. But you can have a mental model of FDA, and so you can predict a little bit kind of what you think the FDA will say, and that goes a long way. And it's also useful to apply uh, um, certain concepts that on the surface look like they don't apply to software, like shelf life, for example. That it may not seem like that applies to software on first glance, but if you try to understand, put yourself in the FDA's shoes back when that guidance was written, um, and then try to forward project that to today, you'll usually come up with some pretty useful um, thoughts. For shelf life in particular, it's like you want to keep your software up to date, and you can't just leave it without ever making any software updates, for example. Like that's how I would conceptualize that one. Um, so again, don't don't go and get templates. Try to understand the underlying principles. Um, these are kind of like requirements for those templates, and um, that'll go a long way to understanding how the templates can apply to your situation. This common problem that we see is that people can download templates they found online. They may be overly complicated, or they're written for the more general case, and for the more specific case, they could really simplify it down. But the only way to not to do that is to understand the requirements that those templates were based on. Also follow the FDA's good machine learning principles guideline, which I'll be talking a little bit about that. But that one's quite good. So don't chase any particular machine learning driven metrics like dice scores. Those are not typically, I mean, those can correlate well to overall clinical performance, but are not the same thing. Also, what I've seen is teams struggle with over optimizing for their machine learning architecture, but they kind of lose track on the clean data. It's actually more important. And also, don't try to shoot for the moon for your first 510(k) submission. You should definitely consider phasing in different features. Maybe start out with the lowest features first, get 510(k) cleared for that, and then move on to more risky features for like version 2. If you use this model that we're talking about, it will significantly reduce the time and cost it'll cost you to do the FDA submission, which is one reason that I've seen that people are can be hesitant to just release with half the features in version 1 and wait for yet a second 510(k) because I think it's very expensive and takes a long time. It can, but if you optimize the process, you can then release your features to the FDA in a much smaller chunk, and that results in better outcome for your business usually. Um, Another important thing to think about is this concept of automation bias, propensity for humans to favor suggestions from an automated decision-making system, even when contradictory information is available without automation, even if it's correct. And so this has been a cause of numerous airline accidents where there may be a gauge that was misconfigured or not working properly, and the pilots took the gauge over reality. And unfortunately, it's really no different when you have a machine learning result put in front of a doctor, and they, especially when that result is reliable most of the time, it can sway the physician into making an incorrect diagnosis because of this idea. And it's up to you, the medical device manufacturer, to identify automation bias and to try to come up with ways to reduce that. And the key here is that the machine learning and physician pair needs to be better than the physician alone. So good machine learning principles, I would encourage you to read this on your own. There's 10 machine learning principles here. I went over these 5, which I find are very useful to talk about now. So the first one, multidisciplinary expertise. What I've typically seen as an anti-pattern is that is the way that some startups or some organizations are set up, where they have the software engineering department is a separate silo from the regulatory department and from the clinical departments as well. And this results in the software engineering department being very laser focused on things like dice metrics and just chasing metrics and accuracies without considering the clinical utility of the output. Um, and a better situation would be if you set up your process in a way that you can close the gap. You can close the technical gap that the clinical team has and the clinical gap that the technical team has. You could close those gaps as fast as possible, then you will result in a much better application, in my mind. This can be done with things like during sprints. Both the clinical team and the engineering team can have like a tumor board where they like look at where they qualitatively look at the outputs and see what to do next. Do you need more data, or do you need to enrich the data with more difficult cases, or other things, not just chasing that dice score down. Good software engineering and security practices is, I think, very important for software that's like this. And what I typically like to use a clean room analogy, like if you're trying to make a micro chip, one small particle of dust could completely destroy that chip, but it's difficult to know what part is destroyed. You just know that the chip doesn't work. This is why you have you might have a hexacore processor, and then you also have a quad core processors, because 2 of those cores had a speck of dust or some other defect that's extremely difficult to debug. And really the only thing that makes economic sense at that point is to just turn off that defect. So then in this case, having a clean room is very important, and that's the way to keep up quality. And in a similar way, for code, especially for machine learning code, a bug somewhere in the pipeline is very difficult to detect, because the software will run without any errors, and really you just know something's wrong at the other end when you have bad results. And so you need to really have a clean room for your software engineering practices and your security practices to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Also, data is representing the intended population, which sounds obvious at first, but unfortunately, you can't just use TCIA data alone. TCIA might be good to come up with a first version, but unfortunately you will have to collect more data. Preventing data leakage. This also seems obvious at first, but there's lots of subtle ways that this could happen. For example, if you decide to partition your data using slice number, you could have slices that are really close together on both your test set and your training sets, and those are very similar. So that's a form of data leakage that can be pretty subtle and kind of difficult to detect after the fact. Which again, going back to the clean room analogy, is like you need to have very strict controls over your process to find things like this, because you're not going to be able to debug this that easily. And of course, talk about before putting the performance focus on the pair machine learning and human. So the FDA just recently put out another guidance about this predetermined change control plan, which I'm pretty excited about. This is in the future. It's still draft guidance, but this is where the FDA is headed, and something that we should all think about. Um, one analogy I like to use is the FDA just doesn't care about the sausage, right? But how it's made. So if you were to put yourself in the shoes of the FDA and you have to protect the public from poorly made sausages, like you would, and you have hundreds of sausage factories to go, right? What would you do? Like you can't obviously go to every single sausage factory and sample every single sausage that comes out. You can, however, inspect the factory, inspect one sausage, and inspect the entire production line of sausages. And now you have inspected essentially every sausage made with that particular production line. But what the FDA is trying to do is take that one step forward and say that the FDA doesn't have to come back for any approved changes to that production line as long as the FDA looks at the process you use to make those changes. So, this is going to lighten the load of the FDA. And it also make use cases like online learning, where you have a machine learning algorithm that runs in a hospital, for example, and it gets retrained at a much more frequent cadence than what you'd normally see. Uh, a predetermined change control plan is absolutely critical for that kind of thing. And just here's some previews about what that predetermined change control plan would be, what would contain in it. You would have to say things about your data management, like how do you collect and train your data, and how do you store it, how do you prevent data leakage, what are your retraining practices, how do you decide when you want to retrain, what do you do when you retrain, performance evaluations, how do you know if that the algorithm is performing reasonably well, and also update procedures, like how do you deploy the algorithm once you have changed it. So this is still in the works with FDA, but it's very exciting because what it means is you could submit how you make the changes, and in the future you don't have to go back to the agency for every change you made under that approved change control plan. So this could shave off months of dev time or months of time that you have to otherwise wait for the FDA. Oh, okay. So we can get more details about the different phases that we have here. And the first phase, exploratory phase. What you want to do here is establish your regulatory pathway. So of the pathways that are available in the United States, the 510K is probably the most popular one and probably the one that is the cheapest to do. And this involves finding a predicate device, so a device that's already on the market that has an established safety profile that is similar to your device. And by proving to FDA that your device is similar to this established one, then that is the grounds for the FDA clearing your device for sale. Also, establishing your overall regulatory strategy should be done here too. That's different than regulatory pathway strategy. That really encompasses more of your entire business. So that's like your go-to-market strategy, and it has things like funding rounds that are tied to maybe your first 510K, or like what you want to build in version 1 versus version 2. Um, and yeah, that's a lot more higher level than the regulatory pathway. But it's important to consider that now, because it really will drive the product development phase. Also, establishing the feasible performance targets. So things like dice scores, in these other type of metrics, you can get a reasonable idea of how well you expect your machine learning algorithm to perform with just 10% of your training data. So maybe you can just use TCIA and just kind of see, well, we can expect with the current state of the art of ML algorithms, we can expect this dice score. And we know that once we collect all of our data, we're gonna maybe add a little bit to that, but it's not gonna swing the needle by much or by a significant amount. So with that information, you can optionally at this point submit your first FDA pre-submission request. And here you're going to want to try to confirm with the FDA of your chosen predicate device. You want to pitch to them your overall testing strategy and your metrics that you're using, how you're computing those metrics, and gather any feedback you can from the FDA. And of course, asking the question why, because you only get an hour with them, but if you ask them why, then you'll be able to hopefully kind of get a sense of why they think the way they do, and you can predict as you go on um, different questions that you have. So the software development phase, as a software engineer, this is the part that I enjoy the most. Um, and here you'll go through your machine learning algorithms, you'll tune your hyperparameters, you'll develop, you'll iterate, um, and at the end of this phase, you're going to want to finalize your clinical performance study design and your performance metrics. So here you'll say that we are even more certain that we can hit this dice score or this sensitivity score or what have you. And this is the important FDA pre-submission meeting to present to the FDA your plan for performance testing. And clinical performance testing can be very expensive if you get it wrong. Very expensive and time consuming if you get it wrong. So it's really important to get it right the first time, because some things you just can't repeat easily, at least. Like if you needed to do a multi-reader study, you can't repeat the same multi-reader study on the same experts that you've done for the previous one, because those experts have probably already seen all the data, so that it's not going to be valid. And that'll just be very expensive to go and find more experts, maybe even collect more data. So it's really important that this happens correctly, and which is why like this first pre-submission meeting should be done now. You also want to start annotating your ground truth that will be used for that performance study, because that can take some time, and it's good to kind of multitask a little bit here. And there isn't much risk doing this now versus doing the actual study. So the validation phase here, your main things you want to get from this is you want to validate your algorithm, and that what you're labeling the algorithm to do matches what it's actually doing. So the first step I've highlighted here is the standalone performance testing, which is basically any sort of performance testing you do that doesn't require a human in the loop to do. So it's relatively cheap to do, because you just have to rerun a Python script, for example. And you can generally do that before you get your pre-submission meeting results. Once you do get that pre-submitting result, then you can think about actually doing a clinical performance study, because you might have to make some changes there. You might have to redo your standalone performance studies, but that's okay. Also, during this time, it's very easy to get blindsided by just working on the machine learning parts and forgetting about, well, this machine learning needs to be packaged and actually deployed in the hospital IT environment. So you need to think about things like how you're going to manage your firewall ports, or like what platform are you going to use to deploy? You're going to use Docker, or like what are you going to do? And the goal is to have a more or less completed product before you go into clinical performance study design. And I've experienced this myself, where we got kind of blindsided by this, and like we have the machine learning models, done, but then there's no way to actually deploy it, and that adds time and complexity. So yeah, and finally, here you want to actually perform a clinical validation study. So the final phase I've written here, the documentation phase, just to be clear, like this documentation happens in all the phases. But I've written it here just to make it clearer, just to make a nice diagram, and also it does tend to be a little bit more heavier on this phase. At minimum, once you submit the FDA submission or the 510K submission, well, it'll take 90 days at minimum to hear back from the FDA. Although you should budget 180 days, just with uh, that's just kind of accounting for some of the back and forth that you'll invariably have to do with FDA. Um, one trick that we've seen, lots of folks kind of get stuck on this is like, well, we submitted the FDA. Now what? Do we just pause all operations and take a 6 month vacation? And the answer to that is no. Um, you can continue to work on product features during this time, but keep in mind that those product features should not diverge too much from what you submitted to the FDA. So if you submitted the FDA version 1.0, you can work on version 1.1, but just make sure it doesn't diverge too much. Because typically what will happen is once you get your FDA clearance, you will actually be releasing version 1.1 for that's your first publicly released version. And you need to justify internally in your own documentation why version 1.1 is still equivalent to version 1.0 as far as everything that the FDA would care about. Um, and I would say like what we've also seen as an anti-pattern is if you have a regulatory driven phase gate, or perhaps you're waiting on some other external regulatory body, that other processes, especially software engineering processes, get blocked on that activity. That's usually an anti-pattern and a sign that some of your processes could potentially be tightened up, and done in a way where you're not ever blocked by something as long as 90 to 180 days. I mean, this is for FDA in particular, but there's other feedback loops like this all over the place, that we've seen companies, either they get blocked on that, or there's always going to be there's some amount of incremental change that happens between the time they submit and then here, and then they're like wondering, well, how do we incorporate those changes back, or maybe we should wait, and then that wait keeps going until they can't, and they can't really resolve this problem. So I think that's a common place that I've seen that could be certainly um, tightened up. So okay, before we get into questions, and we'll open the floor for questions soon. I want to talk to you guys about how analytics could potentially help you. Um, so if you've already developed, or you're finishing up development of your software, and you need to get FDA cleared, we can get you 510K cleared in 3 months. And the reason we'll do that so fast, there's like several reasons for this. One is that we're practicing software engineers, so we can not only give you the templates, but we can help you draft the templates too. So we can look at your code base and help you draft the templates. And we have done this a few times, so we can definitely speed you up there, and also reduce the time that it requires your software engineers to be involved in this, which is something that they usually don't really like doing. I can tell you from experience. Um, we also built a suite of templates and software tools that we're calling the MedTech OS, that will significantly streamline this process. And also, because we are specialized in software, our process cuts out a lot of the complexity, and it brings abstract terms into more standardized terms that engineers will understand and are up to date with the most recent standards. And that can really help teams that haven't done this before. Having that concrete examples and having a team that is well versed in software, I think it's really helped people out. So yeah, as you know, like having a 510K can increase your company's valuation, and if you get it done in 3 months instead of 1 year, that's just a lot more value you can add to your organization. Also, if you need custom software development done, we can help you out there too. We've since we do both software development and we also know the FDA regulations all in one roof. Um, that's certainly a low risk way for you to build software that's going to be compliant. And if you need a team does everything, we can combine those packages together for you. Um, and yeah, it's that will conclude the first half hour of this presentation. Thank you all for your attention, your time, and yeah, now we'll open the floor up for any sort of questions you guys may have. Let's see. If you have any questions, you could type it in the Q&A box or also raise your hand and we can yield the microphone to you. No question. They must have done a great job. I think probably not that good of a job. Okay, so a question from Brian asking, can you advise on the selection of patients' training data? Yeah, so the guiding principle here is you want to make sure that what your criteria is to include and exclude, it matches as much as possible your intended target population. And there's several tiers for this you can kind of think of, like your training data set. And also, okay, this also actually worth clarifying here. There's an unfortunate terminology clash between validation data set and performance validation and validation as it applies to like FDA. So I'm not going to use the term validation. If you're a practicing data scientist, that validation, we'll call it the tuning data set. The training, we'll call it training, and test, we'll call it the validation training, the validation set if you're more if you're more on the regulatory side. So the trainings data set can be of lower grade, if you will. Like if it's really expensive to get multi-institutional data, you may want to consider using only one institution for your training data set, perhaps enriching a little bit with some multi-institutional data. But what's important is your test set. Like that test set is going to be used to prove to the FDA that your device does what you say it does. And that needs to be held at a much higher standard. So that one should be as much as possible reflective of your intended target population. And these are questions that you should ask either on your first FDA pre-submission, if you decide to do that, or your second one for sure. Thanks for the question, Ryan. That's a good one. Any other questions? We have a question from Kivan. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Apologies if not. I have heard about a notion of FDA surveillance of AI software for drifts over time, question mark. Yeah, so what I've heard about this is that the FDA wants to see that you're not using stale data, and that you have a data um, uh, brokering process in place that you can use newer data as it comes in. Um, so as far as I understand, that is still in the draft guidance, but it definitely shows where the FDA is headed in this direction. So what that would mean for it's kind of it kind of goes to back to my kind of my shelf life analysis. Like the shelf life on the surface doesn't appear like it applies to software, but here it's kind of the same thing. Like a AI software has kind of a shelf life. Like as the world changes, as you have more CT scanner manufacturers, as the as the signal to noise ratio increases for these technologies, it makes sense that as a medical device manufacturer, you should incorporate those changes and stay up to date with that. Um, exactly how that's done, it's not clear. I think it's left mainly up to the medical device manufacturer to do your best on getting new data and just making sure that requirement is met. Um, it's also a great question. Um, yeah, thank you. Yeah. So for those that are not aware, TCIA is a publicly available data sets that you can go and download. I think it's good for de-risking and figuring out what product ideas are solvable with current AI, but I wouldn't really use it for. I especially would not use it for your test set. Um, that's probably not going to fly, and for your training as well. I wouldn't use it as your only set of training data. Any more questions? These are great questions.
Hey, you, John, I wrote out a question in the main chat because I couldn't ask it in the QA. But
Oh, okay,
also,
okay.
I would just mention too that the staleness of the data is yet another good reason to try and go for a fast process for smaller 510Ks or working with us.
Definitely. Uh, do you have any suggestions for early stage companies regarding process that should be set up from the start? Um, yes, like ideally, like the most cost effective way is if you do all of this from the start. If we don't have to do retrospective documentation, or at least be cognizant of um, uh, knowing when to stop, like the initial prototyping phase, knowing when to stop that. Essentially, when you've gained enough confidence that you have something that is going to be commercially viable, and you know that you're going to go forward with it, that you want to convert that prototyping into something that will be more compliant with FDA. And the sooner you do that, the less retroactive documentation that you'll need to do. Um, so yeah, that would be my suggestion for companies is to get the process going as soon as you can. And but we do have experience, and it tends to turn out this way more so than not that our clients come to us with an already completed device and they want to get it cleared. Which that's not ideal. Still possible, but it usually ends up costing more than if it was done kind of throughout the process. Kivon asked, will slides or recording of the press? Yes, we will have a recording and we will most likely publish it on our YouTube channel. Um, and the slides, yes, you can send me an email directly, and I can send you the slides. And our contact information is on the slide right in front of you. All right, thank you. Or let's see. Yeah, if there's any more questions, And please feel free to reach out on our channels here. You can reach me by email or LinkedIn. And yeah, would be happy to help you guys in however way we can. Um, all right, with that, yeah, thanks for everyone's participation and engagement, and hope you have a good rest of your Friday and have a happy weekend. Thanks a lot.